Thompson here, and this is a revision video for the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. So just before we start to look at the poem in a little bit more detail, just some general advice to give you for your revision. Remember, don't focus on what you can't do. You are really not expected to teach yourself new material. So if there's anything that you come across in the videos that you don't quite understand and need a little bit of help with, please do let us know. Remember to use this time to revise and prepare revision materials. These will be incredibly useful throughout Year 11. In terms of your revision, you may want to try a variety of different activities. You may decide just to do online tasks through Seneca or Sam Learning one day, and then move on to try some written work next day. You could then follow this by making revision materials. There are some revision aids currently on the shared area for you within the Year 11 Home Learning tab. You can also log on to Sam Learning or Seneca Learning. Your password you should have, and for Seneca you should also have been given a passcode by your teacher. If you cannot access any of these, then please do let your teachers know. When you are revising, it is important to remember you are just revisiting prior learning. In terms of your poem, you must reread the 15 poems from the Power and Conflict cluster in your AQA anthology. It may be helpful to select 3 quotations from each of these poems. You may want to do this via theme. You can then create revision cards for these and learn them. Remember, it is important that you know quotations from each of the 15 poems, as this will be a closed book exam, meaning you can't take your anthology in with you. You can then make notes on each and how each these 15 poems can be linked together thematically and why. It is really important that you understand each of the poems. BBC Bite Size is a really good starting point if you don't have your anthology with you, as all of the poems are listed. Start by choosing one poem to focus on at a time, and make sure you are able to do the following. So briefly explain what the poem is about. Remember, you cannot talk about the poem in your exam if you don't know what the poem is telling you. Make sure that you're able to link the poem to different themes and ideas. Make sure you choose, annotate and learn 3 key quotations, creating them in revision flashcards. Remember, it is important that you know at least 3 quotes from each poem by heart. And to challenge yourself, you may want to explore wide reading and contextual information for the poem. There are new resources to help you with this in the Home Learning folder. We can start to look at the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen in a little bit more detail. I'm going to give you an initial reading of the poem. Whilst you are listening to the reading of the poem, make sure you make any notes of any phrases that stand out to you, any words, and you may also want to start to identify techniques used by Owen in the poem. Here is a reading of Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Our brains ache in merciless east winds that drive us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient, worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men amongst its walls. Northward in destiny, the flickering gunnery rumble, far off the doorway of some other wall. What are we doing here? The poignant history of dawn begins to grow. We only know that war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds that stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets strip the silence, less deadly the air that is back with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering style concealing for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassy ditches. So we drowse, sun doze, lit with blossoms, trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glows with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us all the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child, or field, or fruit. For God's invisible spring, our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie here. Therefore, we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and dust, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grass, pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Okay, so it's important to know a little bit about the poem and his poets and motivations for him writing the poem. So Wilfred Owen, the poet, wrote Exposure in 1917 to 1918, and he himself wrote this poem in the trenches of World War I, not long before he himself was killed in battle. Much Owen's poetry revealed his anger at the war's waste of life and its horrific conditions, which he experienced firsthand. So, as previously mentioned, in order to write about the poem, you must know what the poem is about. So, upon initial reading, we know that the poem is about soldiers in trenches of World War I. The soldiers are awake at night and afraid of an enemy attack. However, it is not the enemy soldiers who seem to be the real enemy. Nature seems to be the main enemy that they are scared of. It is freezing cold, windy, and snowing. The men, while facing this misery, start to imagine returning home. But once they are at home, all of the doors are closed to them. They believe that sacrificing themselves during the war is the only way of keeping their loved ones at home safe. They return to thinking about their death in the icy, bleak trenches at the end of the poem. So now we know what the poem is about, we can start to look at the form, structure and language of the poem. So let's start by looking at the form first and foremost. The poem is written in present tense, and Owen uses the first person plural, e.g. our, we and us. This shows a collective voice, and it shows us how the experience was shared by the soldiers across the war, not just Owen himself. He's speaking for all the soldiers who have experienced the same things that he has. Each stanza has a regular rhyme scheme, so A, B, B, A, C. And this reflects the monotonous nature of the men's experience. So the boredom that they experience waiting between each battle, freezing to death, battling the elements rather than the real enemy. The rhymes are half rhymes and they're jagged, just like the reality of the men's experience. And this reflects their confusion, but also their fading energy. When we look at each stanza ends in a half line. These half lines leave a gap which mirrors the lack of activity. It could also, as an alternative interpretation, mirror the lack of hope that these men also have. Looking at the structure of the poem in its entirety has 8 stanzas, but across the stanzas there's no real progression, there's no real resolution, and there's no real action. The last stanza ends with the same words as the first one, creating a circular structure. This circular structure helps to reflect again the monotony of life in the trenches and the absence of any change. In terms of language, the poem asks many questions in the form of rhetorical questions, and it asks us why the men are exposed to such dreadful conditions, and it also shows us the men questioning their own position in war, and if there is any point at all to their suffering. So we have questions, rhetorical questions like, what are we doing here? Is that we are dying? Owen also uses bleak language to reflect the bleak imagery and the bleakness of the men's experience. It's to remind the reader of the pain that the men and the soldiers are in at the hands of the awful weather, and the lack of hope that the soldiers have. For example, techniques such as assonance and onomatopoeia are used, along with carefully chosen verbs that add to the bleak mood and make the descriptions more vivid and distressing. Owen also uses a lot of personification in the poem, and nature is repeatedly personified, making it seem like the real enemy in the war. Therefore, upon doing this, it's easy to point out the key themes that are conveyed in the poem, such as the reality of war, power of nature, and loss and absence. Therefore, if you're thinking about the theme reality of war, this poem can also be compared to poems such as The Charge of the Light Brigade or Bayonet Charge. Whilst you're focusing on the power of nature, it can also be compared to the poem Storm on the Island. So let's have a look then at the poem in more detail, stanza by stanza. Firstly, looking at stanza 1. The poem starts with a shared experience and the use of pronoun "our." This shows that although it is shared, it is a painful shared experience, with the phrase "our brains ache." Again, in the first line, nature is personified in the merciless icy winds that knife us. The winds are described as merciless and kniving the actual soldiers, and here nature is personified to portray nature attacking them. In the third line of stanza 1, we have the word confused. We also, in the fourth line, have the words worried, curious, and nervous. Again, this shows the different emotions that were felt by the soldiers and how they were almost overwhelming. Therefore, also hinting at why this is a painful experience and why their brains may hurt. The stanza itself ends on a short sentence. The short, simple half line here emphasises their boredom and their tension. So they're just sat waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever does. In the second stanza, on the second line, we have the mention of twitching agony of men among its brambles. The mention of the word brambles here reminds us of barbed wire. It's almost reflective of the pain that is caused by nature. It could also show us biblical history. So it could refer to obviously the crown of brambles that Jesus won at his crucifixion. Line 3 of stanza 2, we have ending with the flickering gunnery rumble. Again here we've got assonance and onomatopoeia. And this really creates a vivid oral description, almost as if we're there. We can hear the war going on in the background. And again, it's mentioned as being far off, like a dull rumour of some of the war. This here is a biblical reference again to Matthew 24:6, where Jesus is foretelling the end of the world. He says in this passage that you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. The stanza ends on a rhetorical question: what are we doing here? And again, it's asking what the point of it all is. It's questioning the point of them being there and why they're losing many of their comrades at war. Again, this links to Owen's own anger at the war's waste of life due to the horrific conditions. Stanza 3, we have the lovely quote, "Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army." So here, dawn is personified and using the language of battle. So she's got an army. Normally, dawn brings hope, it symbolises hope, a new day, bringing new opportunities, but not here. Again, it relates to this lack of hope, this feeling of hopelessness. Again, the soldiers here are helpless against the power of nature, and that there is nothing they can do to change their situation. And again, we've got this semantic field of war. We've got the word attacks, it's violent, and the weather is attacking them on shivering ranks of grey. So again, there is no colour. The use of the word grey shows that there is no colour. The battlefield is cold, it's lifeless, just like the colour grey. But ironically, grey was also the colour of the German uniforms. So again, this aligns nature with the imagery of the enemy. Stanza 4, it starts with some lovely sibilants. We've got sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So the sibilance is mimicking the whistling of the bullets flying through the air and how the battle is now starting. We then have this lovely imagery that the air is shuddering black with snow. So snow is usually white, and it usually symbolises things like purity, hope, light. But here it is being described as being black, which the colour black often symbolises things such as evil and death. Again, emphasising here that nature is the enemy. We then have this almost explored even further throughout the stanza. So we have that imagery of flowing flakes, that flock, pause and renew. So the alliteration in this line emphasises the relentlessness of the snow. It's not giving up. It's attacking them relentlessly. And again, the stanza ends with the repetition of but nothing happens, to show again the monotony, the lack of change. Stanza 5 then starts with this lovely line, one of my favourite quotations from this poem, and I think it's super easy to remember. So pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. So as I said, this is one of my favourite lines from the poem, and again Owen is using personification here. The snowflakes are personified. They're maliciously seeking and feeling for the men's faces in order to harm them. Further on down the stanza, we have mentions of them staring snow-dazed and sun-dozed, and there's almost a half rhyme that's created there, and it's a link between their current situation and the dreams of the past. So snow-dazed and doze, it's sleepy, it's dreaming, which obviously links to how they cannot sleep for their fear, and also their dreams of the past, their dreams of life. And the stanza again ends with a rhetorical question. The soldiers are asking, is it that we are dying? So possibly this one answers the first rhetorical question, what are we doing here? And perhaps the answer is that they are there to die. Grim, I know. Moving on to the next stanza, again, it starts with some lovely quotation that is easy to remember. Slowly our ghosts drag home. So the adverb slowly slows down the tone of the poem. It drags, just like their time in the trenches is dragging. They're waiting. It's monotonous. Nothing is happening. But also the assonance of the long O sounds in this line make the imagined journey even more painful and slow. We've got those images of ghosts as well, the connotations of the word ghost. So they either go home physically dead or they're metaphorically dead. So they're ghosts of their former selves. They're just shells. They are that affected by war that they're no longer human, almost. And here we've got this lovely imagery of fire. So they're talking about the fires in the camp, and they're being described as being crusted with dark red jewels and glowed. Okay, so this is really ironic because the fires usually represent warmth, safety, but in here the fire that is offering them no warmth. They're being described as jewels, and jewels are precious but are cold. Again, they offer no real warmth. So that is significant there. They're practically freezing to death, and even the fire is providing no comfort. We then move on to look at shutters and doors, all closed on us. The doors are closed. Again, it's creating a division with the lions. This reflects that the men are shut out from their homes. They believe that when they go home, they'll be shunned. Or it could also represent that they are people at home are losing interest in their faith as the war dragged on. And then it ends again on a lovely short sentence. We turn back to our dying. So their thoughts go back to the fact that they're dying rather than the images of home. We then start with, since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or throat. So this suggests that they believe they are sacrificing themselves in order for life at home to be preserved, in order to save their families. So again, we've got this ideas of the ideals of war, what they are at war for. And the stanza ends with, for love as God seems dying. So again, we've got this image of their faith disappearing, they're feeling hopeless. And it could suggest that either their love of God is disappearing, or they feel that they're being forgotten by this all-loving, omnibenevolent God. Finally, the last stanza of the poem, we've again got a lovely quotation that is so easy to remember because it is littered with techniques. Shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp, second line down. Again, this creates a vivid image for a reader. And not only does it show us vividly what exposure to the cold can do, it's also again showing that the weather is one of the biggest killers, not just the enemy soldiers. On the fourth line down of this stanza, we have a lovely metaphor here. All of their eyes are ice. So the metaphor is referring to the eyes of the living and also of the dead. It's a vivid description of how they've been overpowered by nature. It hints that the living men are no longer able to feel any emotion. They're cold. Their emotions are cold. They're dead behind the eyes. So it again suggests that if they don't leave the war alive, they still don't leave completely themselves. There's little hope of a future for them in all sense, even if they do return home. And then the stanza ends again on the repetition of but nothing happens. So again, we've got this circular structure. And again, by ending on the same line as the first stanza, it suggests that even death does not change anything. Again, we've got this hopelessness. We've got this boredom. There's a sense of frustration in their situation. And the men are just left there to either die or contemplate their own death. Okay, on that solemn note, I think that concludes our study of the poem in depth. So just a little bit of a reminder of some of the revision activities that you can do in order to revise Exposure by Wilfred Owen. You may want to start by summarising what the poem is about in 4 sentences. Again, it is very difficult to write about a poem if you don't know what the poem is about. After you've done that, you can then annotate the poem. So you may have already studied this poem in the classroom and have the poem fully annotated in your anthology. However, it is important that you go back over these annotations to make sure that you understand them. You may want to print a blank copy of the poem off and see what you can remember from your initial study, and any responses or ideas that you may have from reading it now upon a second glance. Once you have done this, it is wise to select 3 or 4 quotations which you quite like the look of, or that you can explore thematically. Remember, you must explore these quotations by exploding them, exploring multiple connotations of the individual words in your quotations, and identifying any obvious techniques such as metaphors, similes, and powerful verbs. You may then want to look at the poem's form. So how does it appear on the page? How has Owen structured the poem? So how do the order of the ideas come in? Are they chronological? A hint of how to do this is you can look at the effect of repetition and the repetition of the line but nothing happens. What tone does it create? Why is the poem 8 stanzas long, for example? And why does Owen move from present to past when recalling his home? An important part of the exam is also how you connect and link the poems to the context that the poem was written in. So you may want to do some further contextual research. You could find out about Owen and his experiences with war, the dreadful conditions of the trenches in World War I, and the amount of deaths which occurred, not necessarily through combat, but whilst waiting. You could start with the British Library website and the resources in your home learning folder to help you with this. As mentioned earlier on in the video, it is really important that you're able to explore the poems and make links between them thematically. So you may want to start by thinking, how can this poem be linked to any of the other power and conflict poems? Remember that they are all linked by the theme of power and conflict. However, you must now be more specific in the links that you are making. For example, this poem clearly indicates the harsh conditions of war, the reality of war, and power of nature, which ultimately becomes the main enemy. So which other poems also contain this idea? Upon your revision of this poem, if you have any questions or need any further support, then please feel free to email me at any time. You may also want to show me or send me pictures of your revision resources so I can see how you've been getting on with your revision. In the meantime, happy revising.